Hey, everybody. Michael Brooks here, TMBS bonus live stream. If you're watching this, feel free to hit us with a super chat if you want. If you're in a place to do it, go to patreon.com/TMBS. If you need a deal or anything else, let us know. Housekeeping out of the way with super producer Matt Leck. And joining us is Shahid Buttar. He is running against Nancy Pelosi to replace one of our least and most, actually not least, one of our most destructive members of national politics, with somebody who has a serious proactive vision for a serious form of social democracy, but also a profound commitment to our civil liberties and the best of our constitutional tradition, which we as the left need to embrace for ethical and strategic reasons. Shahid, thanks for doing this. Thanks for joining us from the Bay.
Great to be with you, Michael. Thanks for having me on.
How are you, man?
Hanging in, as well as can be expected under the circumstances. I feel very privileged and fortunate myself. I had a chance to volunteer recently with the food bank, and I saw people who were really dealing with challenges, folks who particularly, I was struck by the emergence of folks who seem to be undocumented, who were fearful of getting services from other places, and just the opportunity for people just to pick up a bag of groceries and not have to share an ID, not have to go through some means testing. It really demonstrated to me the best of our country, seeing our neighbors coming together to support each other. And I'm inspired by that, despite the grimness of this moment.
Absolutely. Yeah, and just give us a little update on the state of your race with Nancy Pelosi so people kind of know where that's at. Just give us a little bit of an update on that.
Yeah. So earlier this month, about 3 weeks ago, we had our primary in California. It's a jungle primary. So I was among the winners of the jungle primary, and I'll have the opportunity to be Nancy Pelosi's general election challenger. I'm the first general election challenger she will have ever faced from within the Democratic Party. My job and the aim of our thousands of supporters is to make sure that it's the last one she faces to end her career and make sure that San Francisco gets a new voice in Congress to represent our city's values in all the different ways that unfortunately she has declined or refused or been unwilling to do so over the last 20 years.
So let's talk about. We'll get at the end to this bailout package, which we've talked a lot about on this show, and I think it actually, when we connect the civil liberties question properly and we look at it not just as a question of government surveillance or private surveillance, we see it as a hybrid. We can actually, I think, kind of connect the really just the ultra concentration of, let's call it, platform capitalism with the collapse of civil liberties. And I think that's ultimately where we need to go in terms of our diagnosis and response. But let's start really concretely. About a week ago, there was a bunch of reporting in various outlets, including Politico and Vox, and some actually strong response. As always, I always have the credits due where credits due principle. Mike Lee and Justin Amash with the most visceral opposition to a DOJ essentially it read to me like, insofar as I could read it, there wasn't terribly much reporting on it, but that the DOJ was requesting that Congress allow for judges to hold people in indefinite detention during times of quote unquote emergency. Can you talk about what you know about that, why that's so extraordinarily dangerous, and how that fits?
Thank you for raising it. And I just want to appreciate you focusing on this because it's been, frankly, not the object of nearly enough discussion and conversation over the weeks since these reports emerged. And frankly, what's happening on the Hill in response to the proposal remains very clouded. There hasn't been a lot of reporting, arming inclusion in a set of authorities in a country that claims to be a free republic. I've warned about erosions to civil liberties for a long time, for over a decade. And it was one thing under the Obama administration to be saying that the surveillance apparatus could be used to facilitate restrictions on dissent and nailing the coffin of our democracy. It's an entirely different thing when we're talking not just about surveillance powers, but we're talking about detention authorities,
Right.
not at Guantanamo Bay, but within the United States. And when the person at the top is not someone who we might defer to as at least a thoughtful person with some grounding in rule of law norms. However, you and I both know that the Obama administration, ran frankly to the right on civil liberties issues and governed from the right in office. It's an entirely different calculus, however, with Trump in the White House. There's absolutely no reason to pretend that our liberties are safe when the executive branch is going to Congress without the press paying attention, asking for unconstitutional authorities that could be used in any conceivable way. There's a point to make here. We'll come back to this, I imagine, when you raise the bailout. But the relationship between the president and Congress is important to note here, because Congress has tried at different points, including this week, to limit the president's prerogatives, to impose oversight measures, to at least make gestures towards accountability. They've never worked. This president knows no constraint. He knows no law. He was recently threatening, in fact, promising to deny opportunities for the state of Michigan to get federal support because he didn't like the politics of the governor. That's the person we want to trust with a preventive detention authority? No, thank you very much. I live in a country that has a written constitution. It has basic procedural core protections for individual rights that are meant to protect our democracy in times of crisis. We cannot abandon those protections. We do so at great peril to ourselves and our republic.
Absolutely. So let's talk. Let's set this historically now. And I'm thinking of kind of three sort of main areas: the Patriot Act,
Mhm.
the reauthorization of the Patriot Act, that whole trajectory starting from after September 11th to a couple of months ago, when it was quickly ushered back through Congress with Nancy Pelosi's leadership and, eagerly signed by Trump. I want to then, of course, the Snowden revelations on the scale of NSA surveillance. And actually, this app, it's simply unavoidable. The case against Julian Assange, what he's actually being prosecuted for, is journalism. In terms of this specific charges, and even the ways in which they try to sort of complicate the case, and it would basically, I mean, the way these charges are written, any normal investigative journalist that says, "Hey, do you have information on something? Hit me on Signal," could essentially be, covered by what they're charging Assange with. So, can you just give us that sort of and add more or whatever you want, just the roadmap of how we've gotten where we are in terms of this level of surveillance, and also the relationship between the government and the corporate sector, so that kind of libertarian, like, it's okay if we have a private surveillance economy, right? The way it's actually merged.
Yes.
Um,
We'll start with the Patriot Act. I think that's a fine place to locate it. And for me, it was very alarming. I was in law school at the time. And my focus when the Patriot Act was passed in 2001, when it was rammed through Congress without a debate, without any consideration of its potential impacts, basically pulled off the shelf. It was written before the 9/11 attacks, and it was passed in response to them by a body composed of members who hadn't even read the bill. When that all happening, I was studying what passes for law in this country, and I watched that happen in front of me. And I think a lot of people were wondering, how exactly does this square with anything I'm learning about in law school? And it's striking because that pattern repeated itself. It was about 7 years later, in 2008, in the middle of a presidential campaign, that President, then Senator Barack Obama, wrote a public defense of why he was choosing to vote for a law as a Democratic senator that extended and essentially statutorily ratified the power grab by the Bush administration that it had pursued in the wake of the attacks. And that made it bipartisan. And then when Obama came into office, repeatedly reauthorizing not just the Patriot Act, but then also defending extensions of that surveillance authority into other dimensions. For instance, people think about mass surveillance as a problem with three-letter agencies: the NSA, the CIA, the FBI. That shoe fits, but every police department in the United States is up to its neck in the very same problems. They have not just military gear, but particularly military surveillance equipment that has no business being in the hands of civilian authorities. I'm talking about devices, for instance, that can intercept or even jam cell phone transmissions, devices that can map and track the locations of residents over time. These are not devices and programs that, for instance, conduct persistent aerial surveillance of entire cities. And these are not the powers that are consistent with our claim of living in a free society. You can't be free when you're watched all the time, period. You might still feel free. You're free to go shopping. You're free to be denied a test kit and die of a preventable pandemic. You're free to do any number of things, but in the United States, you're not free to simply do what you want without being watched. And that is a core protection in our Constitution for a reason. And this is the crucial part. It's not privacy. that keeps me up at night. It is the threat to dissent. These surveillance measures are not security promoting. They are career promoting. They are career reinforcing, and they are power insulating. That's how surveillance has always been used in our past. In the United States, we have an over 100-year history of government surveillance being used to undermine dissent from environmental groups, dissent from Native Americans, from Puerto Rican independence activists, from civil rights activists, from Black power nationalists, from white supremacists, people advocating for the equal rights for women, people advocating for peace in the face of US military interventions in other countries. In all these contexts, Americans pursuing their constitutionally protected rights have been treated like criminals by our government. It's unacceptable. And I want to remix here Naomi Klein's shock doctrine, and it'll tie into the question you raised about the corporate public connection. Naomi Klein in the shock doctrine explains how in times of economic crisis abroad, historically, major corporations and international financial institutions like the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank, these are US steered and partially led organizations, that they take advantage of these crises to impose austerity measures, to privatize businesses and enterprises that used to be held in the public sector by the people, and basically laying waste to the rights and entitlements of communities that have sought, for instance, opportunities for support for food programs or housing programs or healthcare programs from their respective governments. That program is now being instituted in the United States. We are seeing the coronavirus used as a pretext to impose not just the privatization of services, but particularly authoritarian power grabs. That's an incredibly gnarly version of the shock doctrine because it's not just economic. This goes to our deepest norms. It could very dramatically impact the contour of our society that emerges from this crisis. And the question in my mind is not whether we have privacy, it's whether we can speak our minds. And if we can't speak our minds, that is the nail in the coffin of our democracy.
Absolutely. And I just want to say, I really appreciate too that you gave us a full tour of groups that, in a lot of cases are fighting for things that we would strongly support. Maybe in other cases are fighting for, or are advocating for things that we would support in ways that we would disagree with. And also abominable groups, white supremacists, people interested in various extremist religious ideologies. And this is actually, I think, another thing that I've really admired about you, and I think we really need to hold, is the notion that it is reintroducing very clearly and very thoroughly the concept that constitutional rights and protections, and I would say also a culture around that, needs to apply to all. That doesn't mean, obviously, that you don't take the appropriate measures to actually prevent violence and harm, but there has been a cultural drift, I think, that flows through, kind of social conventions online and much more ominously, on a policy level of, it's become so normalized, the conflation of, okay, here's a threat, here's a neo-Nazi group, here's Al-Qaeda. Yes, those groups present threats, and clearly they have toxic, grotesque ideologies. Then gets shifted to, so we need to completely throw out the book of what actually protects us all, not to mention civilians, not to mention innocent people who get caught up, not to mention actually intelligent measures that we actually know from the de-radicalization world of how you actually de-radicalize people, which has very little to do, mostly with mass surveillance, torture, detention, and so on. So I really want to appreciate that you're holding that as well, because a lot of us, I think, have lost it, and we better reassert it in times like this. And can you talk about how this fight around civil liberties, as well as your serious advocacy of universal healthcare, housing, and so on, relates to a kind of fusion between, positive and negative liberty that are usually kind of foolishly put as being against each other? And maybe you could also define those terms for folks.
Absolutely. Thank you. I especially appreciate speaking with you because you have a much more cerebral approach to journalism than many of your peers. So I appreciate to share some information that people might not get.
You've
You
been
know,
around my show enough to know that that's definitely not always true, but I appreciate that.
well, I dig it. And just to your point about, my voice on these constitutional issues as an
Yeah.
immigrant, it's very hard to overlook these threats. It's one thing to have a socialism that is grounded from a position of civilizational privilege, and we can locate that socialism, particularly in claims to public resources and treating human needs as human rights. There's another independent dimension of democratic socialism, and that's preserving the opportunity for we the people to control our government. And as an immigrant fleeing the impacts of the U.S. military-industrial complex around the world, and the impacts, the post-colonial racial impacts in the UK and the former British Empire, I've seen up close and personal in my own family's history what that loss of civil liberties can look like. And so I do feel some privilege in standing sort of as a, with one foot in the past and very much an eye to the future, and trying to defend in the present these timeless values. To positive and negative liberty, negative liberties are the rights to be free from X, Y, or Z. For instance, in our Constitution, we have negative rights to be free from unreasonable searches and seizures, supposedly, from prior restraints on our rights to speech, again, supposedly. Take this with a grain of salt, because the words don't, frankly, find a lot of reflection on the ground. And there's a lot of reasons for that. Part of that relates to the co-optation of our courts and the right-wing assault on the judiciary. There's a lot of other pieces to put in there, but just to stay within your question, positive rights are rights to something, not just the right to be free from some arbitrary government intervention like a detention or being monitored or being shot by a cop, but a right to, for instance, food or shelter or healthcare or education. These are the rights FDR, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, spelled out in no uncertain terms. He wrote explicitly about a second Bill of Rights to enshrine in our Constitution not just the negative rights that we have been so proud of in our nation's history, but the positive rights that would make the promise of our Constitution actually real for the millions of Americans for whom it has been reduced merely to words on paper. I'm committed not just to defending the rule of law, not just to defending our democracy, but ultimately the reason I'm running for Congress, the oath of office says that we are there to defend the Republic and the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. And you mentioned some of the groups around the world that have, including here at home, that have noxious ideologies. I want to be very clear. The principal threats to our Constitution, to our Republic, and to we the people of the United States include the President of the United States and the corporate members of Congress who are running our civilization off a cliff as if we were lemmings. And that's in the best case scenario. That was happening before the pandemic, right? I mean, I'm just talking about climate chaos there. And when you couldn't engineer a set of public policies to make a people more vulnerable to a pandemic, if you tried to have corporate for-profit healthcare, we didn't even have test kits available. And now, even after the stimulus package, great, you can get a free test if you can find one, but you still can't get treatment if you're uninsured. There was a 17-year-old who died in Los Angeles this week because he got turned away from an urgent care center because he did not have medical insurance. When you look at the graphs of the pandemic's expansion in countries around the world, we have one of the steepest curves, and it was entirely preventable. And it was the public policy paradigm of these threats to our republic, to our Constitution, our president's inaction, Congress's deference, and the corporate control over our public policy paradigm that has restricted access to the services not only that we need as individuals, but that we as a community need each other to have. There's in the same dimension, the distinction between negative and positive rights is similar, I think, to recognizing public goods in spheres that we have historically treated as commodity exchanges. Healthcare is not a commodity. It doesn't make sense to treat it as a commodity. It's a public good with massive externalities. And to reduce it as we reduce liberty and freedom to a strictly negative conception undermines the fuller thing that we have to protect. In one case, it's positive liberties. In the other case, it's public health. In all these arenas, we see the failure of a system, the bipartisan failures of a system that we can't take anymore. I mean, it's literally killing us at this point. And I don't have to say this to you being in New York, but I am deeply disturbed that thousands of people are going to die because of preventable failures of leadership. That's not acceptable.
It's evil. I think actually we can introduce that terminology, or it's, Achille Bembe, necropolitics. I mean, it is a death cult, and there's an objective reality to that and a subjective one. And yes, I mean, tons of people are dying preventable deaths because of this, and that cannot be forgotten, and it can't be, accepted. We will get to the stimulus, but let's talk specifically, speaking of this sort of murder politics. ICE has not slowed down at all. Talk about that.
So there was, when the pandemic started, and at least in one crucial respect, there has been at least a rhetorical shift I don't know if it's played out on the ground, but when the pandemic had first hit, Trump had previously announced a crackdown on sanctuary cities, including San Francisco, where I live, and surrounding cities that have taken local action to protect the rights of our undocumented neighbors. I'm an immigrant myself. I care very much about immigrant rights. I recognize that the legal pathway to immigration is incredibly not just narrow, but it's not effectively available. We routinely deny international human rights that we fought a world war to establish, including the right to asylum. Anyone who is fleeing violence has a right to seek asylum anywhere. And in spite of that international commitment, for which Americans died, just to be clear, in the Second World War, we fought for that right at great cost. And we have lost that right to our criminal president, who is currently detaining thousands of migrants in detention camps, which are basically disease contagion vectors just waiting for sparks. It's the same thing with the jail and the prison system around the country. I was recently at a press conference at the San Francisco Hall of Justice, and I heard a representative from our public defender's office speak about a client of theirs who was basically abducted by ICE for deportation proceedings at a courthouse where he was going basically because he was invited by local authorities, and local authorities commit, we will not deport you. We value your membership in our community. And the federal authorities basically waged an assault, not only on the local undocumented population, but on the local authorities that claim and hope to protect them. And this is a crucial thing to note here. When you talked about constitutional rights, there's different layers at which to observe these. Some of them are, we've talked about the rights that individuals have that stand in for protections for our society. There's another layer of the Constitution that relates to the divisions and checks among the different branches and the different layers of government. The local opportunities to work around the federal government's inactions and failures are proving vital in the context of the coronavirus response. There's also been vital, we talked about this a minute ago, in the context of the surveillance state. The local governments have added to the federal government's response. We see in the context of any number of arenas, local resistance to federal initiatives like sanctuary cities challenging the ICE crackdown, and Trump then imposing a vindictive further crackdown on those sanctuary cities. This is a tension in our Constitution that is there to protect us. And unfortunately, it's failing because the federal authorities aren't respecting local rule and local authority within their sphere. Further, we've seen ICE raids and the seizure of personal protective equipment in cities where that equipment really needs to be reserved for frontline medical responders. There are cities where the doctors can't get masks, surgical masks, because ICE has them. Why is ICE hoarding personal protective equipment that we should be getting in the hands of our medical professionals? It's almost as if we have engineered policies to spread a virus around and make a pandemic out of what could have been a contained public health crisis. And having particularly immigrants fear ICE enforcement if they go to the doctor, that doesn't just threaten those immigrants and their families. This is a point that I want to make really, really clear. When immigrants are scared of seeking treatment, it puts us all at risk because people can't then be contained. We can't mitigate contagion if people are afraid to seek the care that they need, or even the testing that we all need them to have.
Right.
And this intimidation of our community members, our neighbors, our coworkers, our friends, the people that we live and work and cross by every day, that intimidation undermines public health. It will cost the lives, not just of immigrants, but of US citizens too. And these are unforced errors. That's what really, frankly, pisses me off. We shouldn't be dealing with these problems. We have enough problems to begin with. We don't need to be making them worse. And that's exactly what the ICE crackdown does. I would like to see similarly, and this moment could be a remarkable opportunity for our country to embrace a more humane alternative to policing. And around the country, there's been this spread of lifestyle crimes and broken windows policing models that criminalize people for doing nothing wrong just for their status. Sit-lie ordinances, for instance, that criminalize being unhoused. We need to really step back from that as we're prioritizing what is essential and what is non-essential. We should remember what is essential for the security of our communities. One of the things that is absolutely not essential for our community's security, in fact, one thing that's positively unhelpful for our community's security, is the vindictive, vicious, predatory policing model that intimidates people from seeking the services that they need. It's exactly what we need to stop. And if human rights weren't enough before, I hope that the shared interest in public health is enough to compel us to be more humane going forward.
Absolutely. with this bailout bill, the big top line of it to me is a totally insufficient uh, stimulus for people. And they're going to be back again in another 6 weeks or so to do something else because it just simply isn't enough. And, people maybe should actually be considering what that tells you about the system and how much power actually you might potentially have by withholding your labor, as an example, if you're in a position to do that, or you're terrorized into doing that if you're, a sanitation worker or working at Amazon or Purdue. Uh, and then I think the big top line is that this is a giant theft. And it's not just a giant theft, it is a major push towards, state-run capitalism, essentially. A real formalization of a narrowing of supply chains, of the next wave of ultra monopoly capitalism. And I want you to talk about that. First of all, if you agree, and then just in the responding to it both from a socialist, democratize the economy perspective, and I think a different line, which is less my line, but I think is important in this moment. One that also understands monopoly power in a more narrow sense and sees, just even as an example, that in fact the millions of actual small businesses, not bullshit Republican talking points small businesses, not like, hey, we're going to give this money to Citibank because they give loans to small businesses. I'm talking actual small businesses that create a lot of value and are one of the only places left in the economy that aren't totally monopolized. Like how those two approaches fit into thinking about taking on this fight for the next couple of decades, which it is a different phase of capitalism, and it is integrated with government platform monopoly capitalism.
What you're describing, the sort of state-run capitalism that endorses monopoly power, we have a word for that. It starts with F and it ends in fascism. And people think that fascism is death camps. And fascism has a technical definition that relates to the fusion of corporate and public power. And it entails other dimensions that we also practice: xenophobia. We were just talking about the crackdown on immigrants, militarism and belligerence abroad. Think about Iran or Bolivia or Brazil or Venezuela, right? The shoes fit, unfortunately, entirely too well. And that's one of the things that this corporate bailout might augur, is a leap down what used to be a slippery slope and has turned into a cliff. And we are hurtling from a proud republic with a at least theoretical, if not so real, commitment to democracy, to a country that has formal recognitions of authoritarian state power. There's a distributive aspect to the bailout. I think this is what you might have been alluding to with in the context of the socialist analysis. And we see, I'm grateful on the one hand for the $500 million that's been set aside for direct stimulus to workers and families, particularly students and gig economy workers. So I do want to, in the interest of giving credit where it's due, just note, and I think this is the squad's influence. We saw the Progressive Caucus flex hard in Congress and force Pelosi to accept measures that would, for instance, provide unemployment benefits to students for the first time. Bernie Sanders fought to make sure that the unemployment benefits got extended, so it wasn't just a one-time payment, but that at least there's an opportunity for ongoing support through the unemployment channel. Those measures notwithstanding, you're right, this is a giant corporate bailout. And there's one part of this that connects to a couple different threads in our conversation that I find especially alarming. One of the parts of the final bill that enticed the support of many senators were oversight provisions that were supposed to constrain the Trump administration from using its $500 million corporate slush fund to basically reward the president's crony friends, to ensure the accountability that would give we the people some assurance that this program is being used responsibly to support the economy and not just hand out favors to the president's buddies. And he issued a signing statement yesterday that was the equivalent of giving Congress the middle finger, saying, thanks for this $500 million. I'm not going to give you any transparency or any accountability. You all like those words. Forget it. I'm not complying with them. And we saw this pattern under the Bush administration, the proliferation of signing statements that effectively refuse to abide congressional directives. It's incredibly dangerous in the constitutional design. Congress is the first branch. It's the subject of Article 1 for a reason. because popular sovereignty is where the legitimacy of our government inheres. The executive branch is supposed to take its direction from the legislature, not impose its direction on the country. And that's what we are witnessing, is a president unapologetically flipping the bird to Congress saying, I'll take the money, thank you very much, and forget it with your accountability restrictions. We should all be alarmed at that, not just Democrats. Republicans too. I mean, this is a thing, I think back to the impeachment saga, when this president could have been removed from office if we just pulled all the threads to investigate his corruption. Republicans care about good government, some of them. And I think of many of them, I'm thinking of the ones who are particularly out of power within their party now. Many of them are aghast at what is happening. There's nothing conservative about the Trump administration. It is radical. It is radically fascist and reactionary. Conservative would suggest stasis, maintaining a status quo. We're maintaining all the bad parts of the status quo and dialing them up. And that's what this bailout unfortunately leans into. I'm grateful for the protections for gig workers and for students. We need to see more. I particularly want to see, and I think our communities need, a rent and mortgage moratorium. It is critical. There's no good reason that people should be paying rents and mortgages when we can't go to work. It's senseless. And it will put people on the street. Here in California, our governor Newsom, thankfully, he announced a delay on evictions, but people who aren't able to make their rent payments on April 1st could still get evicted in July. We need not only to suspend these payments, but to announce a freeze. People shouldn't be held accountable for their housing costs in a situation where the economy shut down. That forces working people to pay the costs to which otherwise the banks would be subject. And I newsflash for anybody not paying attention to the economy, the banks have more money than we the people do, especially since the government just hurled $2 trillion at them. So we should be aware of the context in which we're operating. A key principle here to remember: I think everybody right now feels in crisis, personal crisis, health crisis, financial crisis. None of us are alone. All of us are feeling this pressure, and we shouldn't have to deal with it. And together we can ensure that these are collectively borne responsibilities and challenges, not ones that fall on the shoulders of the weakest members of our society. This is a crucial moment for the history, I think, of our republic. Will we stand together, or will we fall apart? And I'm very eager to see us stand together in the face of this corporate and authoritarian power grab. And the combination of them leads in a very dark place. And I'm decidedly unwilling to see the United States fall into that dystopian future.
Shahid, there's two more areas I just want to cover with you in like about the next 10, 15 minutes. So one, I just really want to, hit something you alluded to before. In an acceleration of lawfare, we've already seen the Justice Department use lawfare to target left-wing governments across Latin America, most infamously in their role in making Lula a political prisoner. And there's actually was new reporting from The Intercept, I think about a month ago, right around the time that the corona really started to arrive, that revealed another layer of cooperation between the DOJ and the Lava Jato team. So that becomes something that anybody with analysis and reading Brazil Wire could tell you. And as Lula himself said, I have strong suspicion, but no direct evidence. We're starting to get that direct evidence. Now we've seen the Southern District of New York put a $15 million bounty on President Maduro of Venezuela, literally like just offering, basically treating him as the head of a drug cartel.
I had not heard.
I'm sorry. Yeah, again, because there's a million different things happening. This just happened about a day or two ago. This is an incredible escalation of obviously ongoing coup and regime change efforts by the administration and the intelligence apparatus. And then, there's many different things, but the other thing that must need, and I've talked about this before, but just needs to be centered. We are now, and I try to be very precise about terms. So like the sanctions against Iran were always utterly unjustifiable and coercive and had a brutal humanitarian toll. Right now, in the context of Corona, we can actually start to say that this is genocidal.
Mm-hmm.
We are actively participating in the denial of basic care in a way that will generate a massive unnecessary loss of life. And the reporting from the administration is obviously not only that they don't care, but Pompeo sees it as an opportunity. Mm-hmm. So I'd just like you to talk about the kind of, the U.S. empire still going here aspect of this.
Yes, thank you for that. And I don't mean to say this too glibly. I think you'll get the spirit in which this is intended. It's not just Iran. that the administration is committing this
Yeah, of
genocide
course.
deprivation of resources to, it's happening to New York City. I
Right.
mean, it's actually here at home. I mean, these sorts of abuses that we used to just think about being the subject of international interventions, it's our chickens are coming home to roost, and they are here now. And lots of people are paying very profound prices for the inability of our system to get in front of these, again, preventable failures. In the context of the empire, I see this as an existential issue, not just for my campaign, but for me as a human being. Like I exist in the United States because the United States supported serial military interventions in the native country that my parents fled in the 60s, Pakistan. So I am the result of an intergenerational response to military industrial corruption. Latin America has seen it worse than anywhere. In dozens of countries over the last 70 years, our country has invaded, in some cases, effectively occupied, either through like formal measures, and I'm thinking there of like Iraq, Afghanistan, or informally, where the IMF and the World Bank does it for us, like in Chile and Argentina and Guatemala, and Dominican Republic and Nicaragua and Grenada. I could go on. But in each of these contexts, we have decided, the United States has decided under the administrations of Democrats and Republicans to put human rights behind corporate profits and to use our military industrial complex, whose architect warned us to fear it, to effectuate this not just invasions, not just the destabilizations of democratically elected governments, but particularly corporate resource grabs, extraction of minerals, extraction of oil and gas. I want to connect that to the climate crisis. Not only are we talking about an empire run amok and continuing to run amok, even while the world is bearing the brunt of this pandemic, but there's a whole other crisis that preceded this, right? Climate chaos. And it is largely our fault. It's not just the case that we've incentivized a market situation to pull every drop of oil out of the ground. We have gone so far as to invade other countries when they try to keep it from us, to pull it out of the ground for ourselves. That's the story in Iran. That's why the US and Iran have such poisoned relationships. In the 1950s, there was a domestic revolution there. Pardon me. Well, the revolution was in '79. The coup was in the '50s, but the coup responded to an attempt by Iran to nationalize its oil fields. And why did we impose a brutal dictatorship on Iran? Because we wanted the oil that the country tried to keep from US and UK corporations. That pattern continues. And when, before we were talking about the threat of fascism consolidating in DC, make no mistake, this is not a strictly domestic problem. We are witnessing the emergence of fascism around the world. One of its epicenters is Washington, D.C., where the Trump administration is actively supporting Duterte in the Philippines, Bolsonaro in Brazil, right? What you shared with me about the warrant in the Southern District of New York for Maduro, that is preposterous. I don't understand how people get away thinking they can do this stuff. I mean, that is an act effectively of war,
Oh
right?
yeah. Oh, absolutely.
I,
I mean,
I,
it's taking. I mean, it's very Obama to Trump, right? Like we were doing lawfare in this, very sort of calculated, strategic, with this totally similar effects. I mean, we started reversing the gains of the pink tide, and we did support the coup against Zelaya, but now it's just literally like, essentially, let's just put a hit on him. I mean, it's absolutely atrocious.
I
Shahid, I've been kind of yeah.
unlike a mafia organization. Sorry.
Yeah, it's mafia shit. That's it. I want I've been asking everybody this. I actually think it's very practically important. Uh, I'm not just on my like spiritual trip or whatever. I really think that in the midst of all of this, people need some type of clear-eyed, grounded way of feeling individually and in community and in a broader macro context that all is not lost,
Mm,
that there is a capacity to do some things, that there is potential. If we close the idea of potential, then there isn't potential. I want to encourage everybody. I'll just say this real quick. I'm going to do another donation to Shahid's campaign. It's very tight for people, so obviously feel nothing if you're not able to do this. But if you are, I would consider doing that. I think that this campaign, specifically with regards to Pelosi, is extremely important. So I'll say that. But there's the physical stuff we've talked about. There's checking out community, taking tech breaks. I mean, I'm talking on every single level. Do you have anything to kind of leave people with that will, you know, some empowerment, some positivity, some sense of what could be?
Yeah, happy to. And I appreciate your support. Thank you. And that invitation. This is a moment where we can all feel like we're hanging out to dry by ourselves. But again, realize that none of us are alone in this. We're all sharing the same challenges. We share the same communities. If you're healthy, I would encourage you to look for ways to serve your community if you can. Uh, I think there's a real moment here. I often think about the internet in this particular time. Having worked at the Electronic Frontier Foundation, I've spent a lot of time defending the internet, and never have I been more grateful for it than now. You know, I think about what
Yeah.
this process of shelter in place would look like for us 30 years ago, right? It would be at least more miserable, and it would also be isolating and atomizing. And we have the opportunity, the privilege, I dare say, of being able, while physically maintaining our distance for public health reasons, we still can come together, and we are. I'm hearing stories from, I'm on the phone a lot, and I hear stories from people all over the country about the connections that they've made, both with new friends and old ones, because people, I think, realize, A, when we don't have the capitalist boot on our neck forcing us to work 16 hours a day, there's a lot of time you can do things. And B, it's in these moments where I think our most basic expectations are challenged and threatened, that we have the opportunity to remember what matters most to us. And I think what matters most, at least to me, is love, relationships, community, the people. In It's why I'm running for Congress, to defend people from the abuses of machines and institutions, and remembering the people in our lives and connecting with them and taking advantage of this time to make sure at least that your loved ones know that you're thinking about them, doing what you can to support them. Getting groceries to people who need it is an available thing here in San Francisco. I'm sure that there are similar opportunities wherever your listeners might be. This is a moment for us to reclaim our power and our agency and our sovereignty from the institutions that have taken it, and not practice responsibility, practice responsibly the use of the authorities that we have trusted to them. And it's in that moment that we need to come together. And we have that opportunity, online for now, and hopefully in person when the pandemic passes. But I just want to particularly invite your listeners just to remember that they're not alone. We are, unfortunately or ultimately, for better or worse, we are all in this together.
Yes. Interdependence is a fact. Shahid Buttar, I really appreciate it. Godspeed, brother. Everybody, you can support Shahid's campaign, not just, also on social media, also by amplifying it in any number of ways. And of course, we'll have a second part of our conversation with Joshua Kahn Russell for patrons tomorrow. That's actually another mutual connect between us. And Tuesday, we'll be back live, tons more show. So check it out. And you can also, if you want, you can pre-order my new book, Against the Web, Cosmopolitan Answer to the New Right. Thank you, Matt Luck. Thanks each and every one of you. Thank you, Shahid. Peace and love. Take care, everybody.